Welcome back to Market on Close. I'm Sam Vardas in for Marley Kate, and today the national average for gas prices stands at $3.08 per gallon, according to Gas Buddy data. That is down 4.6 cents from a month ago and is 27.9 cents per gallon lower than a year ago. Joining us now to see how long the downtrend can continue is Patrick De Haan, who is the head of petroleum analysis at Gas Buddy. All right, so they're holding steady for now, steady as she goes. But what's your outlook? Can they keep holding steady?
Well, in fact, I think not only can they keep holding steady, but as we get closer to Labor Day and we get into the fall months, we typically see gasoline demand declining as we've seen kids back to school. In addition, in about 4 weeks, much of the nation is going to begin the transition back to cheaper winter gasoline. So not only are we going to see cheaper prices in the next few weeks, of course, subject to hurricane season, but I think by the end of the year, the national average has a pretty good chance of falling below that $3 a gallon mark, something that we haven't seen a whole lot here in the last few years. So not a bad time. Oil prices remaining relatively low. A lot of the low prices we're seeing right now across the country being enabled by the low price of oil. Of course, there's always higher prices. The West Coast right now still well over $4 a gallon, but 25 states today where the average price is below that $3 a gallon mark.
Yeah, obviously, some states are paying more than others because of some of those taxes and regulations. I'm just wondering what developments you're watching out there. I mean, you mentioned Mother Nature. Obviously, that's something that you people keep an eye on, but also, you know, around what's happening with the geopolitics with regards to Russia and Ukraine. I mean, you know, how much is this likely to influence gas prices at the pump?
Well, to your point, not only Russia and Ukraine, absolutely. So many countries have been slapping sanctions on that Russian oil. India and China have still been buyers of that. President Trump going very strongly against India, who continues to buy that Russian oil by slapping 50% tariffs. So there's still a lot of geopolitical mess from what's happening. Now, if there is a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, I think that there could be a limited downside to the price of oil, especially if those sanctions on Russia are eased as part of a potential ceasefire or peace deal. So that is certainly a wild card to keep an eye on. As I mentioned, OPEC oil production, they basically scaled back in the entirety all of the cuts that they put on in 2023. So if there is a peace deal in Russia, combined with OPEC increasing oil production, we're probably going to be looking at more of a glut as we get closer to the end of the year. That could push oil potentially below that $60 a barrel mark, and that could pave the way for gas prices dropping to multi-year lows. If there's no peace deal, while oil prices still are likely to be relatively low, and as we get closer to the end of the year, there still likely will be an overhang as OPEC is now producing more than demand is across much of the globe, and that should continue to keep oil prices well below the $70 barrel mark.
Right. I mean, how much are you paying attention to that sort of prevailing supply-demand narrative out there right now, which seems to be at least keeping a lid on those prices for now?
Well, as you mentioned, the prevailing price, we still have a lot of inflation to talk about, right? The Federal Reserve continuing to eye potentially September for rate cuts, and even that is still something that could impact into global oil prices. And keep in mind, if we continue to see U.S. interest rates holding at these levels, that really stymies growth a bit, and that could lead to lower oil consumption and thus put more downward pressure on prices. If we do see the Fed cutting interest rates here at least once, maybe twice by the end of the year, there could be a little bit more upside in terms of global oil consumption. So even things like the Federal Reserve and interest rates are getting involved in this. And keep in mind, there's a lot of geopolitical tension still. President Trump still navigating trade policy, and there's still some tentacles hitting the oil markets in regards to all of that.
Yeah, I mean, have you got any thoughts on, you know, as far as Trump's policies versus what we've seen before, you know, particularly with all the talk of drill, baby, drill, you know, as far as, you know, sort of domestic production and, you know, how that sort of feeds into that supply-demand dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, great observations here. The president can implement policy. Policy is not law. The president can make it easier for oil companies to drill, but that is not law. It does not compel them to do so. In fact, the U.S. Energy Information Administration highlighting that oil prices being in the low 60s right now is likely to lead to a slow erosion in U.S. oil production by 2026. They anticipate record production this year, but next year, as we see the oil rig count continue to slowly decline, that's the barometer for U.S. oil production will likely be next year. So much to the chagrin of the president, drill, baby, drill doesn't have a whole lot of teeth to it. It does not compel U.S. oil producers. Oil producers are still going to react to diminished economics by likely easing oil production in the next 6 to 12 months.
Well, that's good. That's right. I mean, the price is good for Trump, good for those at the pump, not so much for perhaps investors, some of those companies. I'm just wondering, when things flared up in the Middle East a couple of months ago, and, obviously we're all glad that things have calmed down since then. There had been a big conversation about, just how diversified the US market was as far as being able to keep a lid on those prices, to certainly keep them in check. I'm just curious to get your thoughts on just how true that is. If we do potentially see some sort of idiosyncratic or sort of flare up in some of these tensions with, respect to Russia, Ukraine, or what is happening in the Middle East, how well insulated the US is if this is such a political sensitive spot, for Trump, but also for consumers who are, obviously mindful of how much they're paying at the pump.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's probably why President Trump has kept a back foot in the door of Venezuela, right? Allowing Chevron to continue drilling there has been instrumental. The president is keeping some of those doors open. That's probably why OPEC, and including MBS of Saudi Arabia, are looking at the Trump relationship a little bit different. That could be behind why OPEC has raised production this year. The president knows that oil prices and gas prices are a fixation of Americans, and he's keeping some of those back doors open, allowing some of that Iranian crude oil to flow while continuing to ratchet up pressure on them. Iran really has very few options, but the president allowing some of that oil still to trickle to the market. If he really wanted to shut the door, he could shut the door completely to Venezuela, and he could make it much harder for that oil to flow out of Iran. In addition, he could still ratchet up the pressure on countries doing business with Russia. But for India right now, there's a tremendous amount of pressure. But I think President Trump is leaving some options for himself in case some of these geopolitical situations or trade policies tend to sour.
Patrick De Haan, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Schwab Network. Really appreciate your time. Patrick